quantum information in the last some 20, 30 years. And in quantum information, what we have achieved so far. So let me just see what is there. So in quantum information, we have done quantum cryptography. We did quantum. So we have been able to distribute information securely with using quantum cryptography, and of course, very simple phenomena. And then quantum teleportation, in which we can teleport the state of a particle without actually transmitting the particle itself. And then we have seen how the qubits behave and use those qubits in the quantum computers. And so we have done, in fact, the quantum simulations, and we have seen that we have some certain we can break some complexity, computational complexity classes using the bounded quantum polynomial time computation. And of course, then there are many applications. Now we are in the era where the quantum technology has many applications, like in the condensed matter physics and quantum biology, cold atom physics, quantum chemistry, and all this. But let's focus on the quantum information part, which is actually the quantum, which I'm going to talk about today. Okay. So this I have taken from Dominic Willeman. If you look at it, he has many maps like classical physics and a physics map as well, and you can see it on his YouTube channel. So he has some good stuff. Okay. Let's see what we expect from a quantum computer. So since there are many ways in which a quantum computer can be built, so there's some criteria which a quantum computer has to fulfill in order to be able to do quantum computing, to be called really a quantum computer, which can solve all problems posed to it. So you can see it in Barry Sanders' small book, How to Build a Quantum Computer. You can, it's free online available, so you can check it there. So so it's a criteria by DeVincenzo's, and you can read it as music. So it should be, the first thing is that it should be measurable, which means that whenever you run the computation, you should be able to run to measure each qubit at the end, qubit by qubit. Okay, you should be able to individually measure each qubit. This is the criteria for a quantum computer. Then it should be universal. Universal means that it should be able to solve any problem posed to it. So it's not just that it can solve some problems, but any quantum problem that is posed to it, it should be able to solve. And the Google has been claiming that it's, of course, there are certain quantum computer architectures which can do some sort of computation, but not all quantum problems. Then, and a very important thing is scalable. That is, as you increase the size of your problem, that is the number of qubits that you need, the resources that you need to solve that problem, it should not grow exponentially. It should be doable, and it should grow polynomially with the size of the problem. So this is what is meant by scalable. And then initializable. So your quantum computer should be initialized in such a way that all qubits initially are in the every time you end a computation, you can bring it back to the 0 state, and then you can use it for further computation. So all qubits must be in the same state 0 initially, and of course then you can manipulate them, do some operations on them according to your requirement. So this is a picture of the ions which are in the same state initially, and then they are used for quantum. It is the actual quantum computing picture of the ions that are used in computing. Then it should be coherent. Coherent means that it should not be interacting with the entire with the atmosphere and lose its coherence. That is, it should not lose its state. So, which means that there should be a ongoing quantum error correction process built in the quantum computer. So the thing is that, of course, in the classical computer also there is an error correction process which keeps on going, but such an error correction process should be available in the quantum computer as well. Qubits, as we will see later, they lose their state as soon as they are measured. So you have to correct the errors without measuring the qubits. And it was not until Shor gave his Shor code in order to correct the bit and the phase errors. It was not until then that quantum computing was taken seriously, because quantum error correction should be is a necessary feature of any computing. Error correction is a necessary condition for any computing, and so for quantum as well. Okay, so these are the things that are necessary for anything to be called a quantum computer. Of course, we will talk about non-universal computing, but we are focusing on what we can do now with it. So we relax one condition, which is the universality. Let's move on. Okay, classes. What do we expect quantum computation to solve, and what in fact are the complex problems that are there? So there are the problems that are in the P class. So these are the various classes, complexity classes. There are some problems which are in the P class. Okay, there are certain problems which are in the P class. The P class problems are which are efficiently solved by classical computers, and in the polynomial time. So that is why they are called the P complexity class P. And there are NP problems, which are in fact the decision problems, that is yes or no problems. These problems are cannot be efficiently, may or may not be efficiently solved, but there are NP-complete problems which cannot be, where there is no algorithm available which can solve it really in polynomial time. So so there are certain problems which are NP problems, decision problems, and these problems are the quantum computer, which is the bounded error quantum polynomial time computation, this BQP, which means bounded error means that you expect the quantum computer to solve it with some error, right? Which is of course which is kept as less than 1/3. So you expect that it will solve some problem. So this is the region where it can outperform the classical computer, right? And then there is P space, where you have and all these are included in the P space, which needs the polynomial space in order to solve any problem. And the complexity, it increases in this direction. So these are the least complex problems, the P problems. Then the complexity keeps on increasing till the NP complete they're not solvable, and then it keep on going. Then there are in 1979, Valian introduced a new class, which was called the sharp P complexity class. The sharp P problems are the counting problems associated with the decision problem. So these are the problems associated with the NP problems, and these are the counting problems. For example, you ask somebody a question that is the permanent of a matrix 0 or greater than 0? It's a decision problem, yes or no. But you may also ask somebody that what is the permanent actually? So you have to do a lot of, so that is a hard problem. So decision problem is the same problem associated with that decision problem, yes or no. There is another problem which is very hard, which is called the sharp P problem. And sharp P hard problems are those problems which are as hard as any other problem in the sharp P class. So which means that no other problem is harder than that problem. So in fact, Valian introduced this sharp P complexity class. And of course, you can see, of course, these boundaries are, I've drawn it very roughly. It may not include all of the NP class. It is not proven. And it may not, but just to show you that there are some problems which are not even in the NP, they are being solved in the sharp P class. So and Valian, in the same paper, he introduced this complexity class with reference to the permanence of the matrices. So permanence, and he said that permanence to find a permanent of a matrix is a sharp P hard problem. I am mentioning this particular class over here because I will talk about the linear optical quantum computing, which deals with this class, sharp P hard problems. So the permanent is, what is a permanent? Permanent is, as you can see, it is, so if my matrix is a 3 cross 3 matrix, my or a 2 cross 2 matrix, my permanent would be U11, U22 plus U12, U21, right? And in the same way, for a 3 cross 3 matrix, there are all 6 permutations, and sum of all those permutations is a permanent. Just like a determinant. Determinant has a negative sign in between, alternate negative signs, and permanent has all positive signs with the same terms as the determinant, right? So, and it's a sharply hard problem to solve classically. But there are certain quantum computing architectures which can solve this problem very efficiently. Okay, so let's move on and see what do we have in hand as a resource and what we can do with it. So the first thing is a qubit. So qubit is very different from the classical bit. Classical bit is can be only in the 0 or 1 state, either 0 or in 1 state. There are only 2 possible states. Quantum bit, which is called a qubit, which is in fact any quantum entity which can attain 2 states, but the advantage of this quantum bit is that it can not only attain 2 states, but it can exist in the superposition of those 2 states, which are 0 and 1. So if I call this as 0 and this as 1, the quantum bit would be only these blue dots, and the classical bit will be only these 2 dots, which are the states bit values 0 and 1, the classical bit values. And the quantum bit, we just put this ket sign, if you are not familiar with bracket notation, these ket signs to represent it that it's a quantum state. Okay, nothing fancy about it. So it's just a representation of a quantum state. So then it can exist in the superposition of the 0 and 1 state. Not only this, that it can exist in the superposition, but it can take all possible values on this sphere. This sphere is in fact called the Bloch sphere. Bloch sphere means that it contains it represents the state of a qubit, and a qubit is in fact a ray on the Bloch sphere. So it is a point on the Bloch sphere, which is a ray originating from the center, and a qubit can take, since there are infinite points on the surface of the sphere, so a qubit can take infinite values. So it can take continuum of values between 0 and 1. It is not restricted to just 0 and 1 values, and it can exist in superposition. In fact, we write the state of the qubit as psi is equal to alpha 0 plus beta 1. So you can see that not only it can take all possible values, but it can have complex amplitudes with these 0 and 1 kets. So the thing is that you can see where we are on this y-axis. If you take the state of qubit, it is and it is the iota sign over here. So this is one of the states which has the complex amplitude. This doesn't have, but there are many states on this Bloch sphere which have complex amplitudes. These alpha beta can be complex for them, and they can be anything. Of course, the Schrödinger cat of the Schrödinger cat, which has been which was a thought experiment, but it can be it is in fact in the superposition of the dead and the alive state before anybody measures it. And then there can be the spin, which can also exist in superposition of up and down spin of an electron. So spin of an electron can be used as a qubit. And then there can be in the photons, there can be horizontal and the vertical polarizations, in which it can be it can exist in the superposition again, and it can take continuum of values. So this is very advantageous for us, but there are certain problems with the qubit that we have to see whether we can use them for our advantage, or we can or how we can get around them if they are a problem. So let's look at the characteristics of the qubit. First thing is that there is a no cloning theorem. You cannot clone an unknown quantum bit, which means that so how can we say that? It is because of the linearity of quantum mechanics. So if there is a up state and there is a blank copy, and there is a 0, which is your cloning machine, which is in the state 0, it goes to the state up, and f up. So the state of the cloning machine is f up. The same cloning machine can be exactly copy another state, which is in the down state, p0, and it will be down, down, f down, right? So up, down, I'm talking about them as 0 and 1 states. But if I use another state, which is the superposition of up and down states, and I don't know what state it is, so I may think that my state is still up or down, and I use the same cloning machine. And so the same cloning machine is in the 0 state. I have a blank copy. And then when I make a measurement on it, when I make a clone of it, so then the linearity of the quantum mechanics comes into play. So it will be this converting into up, up, F up. So the cloning state of the cloning machine is F up, the same as there, and down, down, F down. But this is not what we wanted. We wanted a copy of this horizontal state. And this should be what we are expected to have in the end. So we are not having with the same cloning machine, which made perfect clone of up and down. It cannot make a perfect clone of a superposition of them. So if a qubit cannot be copied with absolute fidelity, so it cannot be read with absolute fidelity. So which means that for a quantum computer, if we have to read a qubit, we are at disadvantage for that. But what can we do about it? We'll see later. Then one thing that is good about it, that quantum information can be transferred with absolute fidelity. But what the requirement is that the original must be destroyed, right? So you cannot transfer information such that you keep the original and then you transfer the information as well, which means that you are making a clone, in fact. So you cannot do that. But if you destroy the original, then you can transfer the information with absolute fidelity. Of course, this is done in quantum teleportation, where the original qubit, we do a Bell state measurement, destroy the original state, and the state is copied on the state with Bohr, right? So this has been used in quantum information. So we can see that whether we can manipulate it. Then this is very important, that, okay, quantum computing can be done, and we know that we have to do a measurement in the end, qubit by qubit, which was the requirement of the five criteria points of quantum computation. But whenever we make a measurement, we destroy the information, right? If we are not measuring in the same basis in which the quantum state is prepared, which we do not know, because without measurement we cannot find, it can be prepared in any other state. This quantum state that you are receiving, you don't know its state already. So measurement will, if you do not measure it in the same basis, it will destroy the information. Then another distinct feature, which is not there classically, it is that there are non-compatible observables. For example, position and momentum, energy and time. There are even in theoretically, even in principle, you cannot make combined measurements on such observables. So this is also what is not there classically. And then another thing which is a distinct feature of qubits is that if there are more than one qubit, there can be non-local correlations between them. And these non-local correlations are called entanglement. So you can exploit that, and we can in fact, we have used it in our work, and I'll show it to you how it can be used for some computational task. Okay, so let's see, in computation, what are we expecting? So a single qubit state, as I wrote, was alpha 0 plus beta 1. And a 3 qubit state can exist with complex alpha I. And I can write it as 0, 0, 0 plus alpha 1 and all these 7 qubits, 7 states. So it has, if I call the first one 0, 0 to be logical 0, the second one is, so there are 8 states that I can represent with these vectors in there. So whatever operation I do on a quantum, on this quantum state, it will be done, because of the linearity of quantum mechanics, it will be done on each and every state vector separately, right? Linearly. And then, which means that I have done a computation on all these state vectors simultaneously. So what does it mean? It means that if I have an n-qubit state, which is composed of 2 raised to the power n state vectors, so since each can take a bit values, a qubit value 0 or 1, so I have like these registers, these X registers, which can be which will be the ket vectors, and there will be a total of 2 raised to the power n of them, and in each X there are n qubits, and which means that if n is 1000, then there are 2 raised to the power 1000 complex alpha x. And in fact, a simple operation keeps track of all those complex alpha x, right? So, but the problem, so we have to see that whether we can manipulate that for our advantage or not in quantum computation. So, in single computational problem, in single operation on such a qubit, it is so in a single operation, it can I'm sorry, there was a message from Zoom. So in a single operation, it is computing all these states simultaneously. So the problem is again with the measurement. In the end, if we doing all that computation, when we measure, it will collapse to one of these vectors. So we will come to know the state of only one of the vectors. Okay, and then and that also with probability alpha x modulo square, very randomly, right? This is what the quantum measurement is. So can we still take advantage of that? So the thing is that in fact we can. What we do is we manipulate the probability amplitudes rather than the probability itself of getting some output state. So let's see, the quantum gates that are actually the unitary operations. So any quantum gate acting on a qubit is actually a unitary operation. And when I told that this qubit state is a ray in the quantum on the Bloch sphere. So any unitary operation will rotate this ray on the Bloch sphere. So it will remain on the Bloch sphere, and it can go to any state on the same Bloch sphere, right? So any unitary operation is just the rotation of this ray on the Bloch sphere. Okay. So which means that if it goes to the new place, it goes to the new ray, it attains a new ray, then there will be new alpha prime and beta prime, right? So the whole operation of unity is giving it a new values of alpha prime and beta prime, right? New values of coefficients alpha and beta to a qubit state. So the thing is that these, in fact, the probability amplitudes has been changed. So these alpha and beta, since alpha modulo square is the probability, alpha is the probability amplitude, and similarly, beta modulo square is the probability of being in state 1. Beta is the probability amplitude. So the probability amplitudes, they can add up destructively and constructively, because the probability amplitudes are complex and they can attain values, and they can interfere in such a way. We can make them interfere in such a way that the wrong answers in our computation, they cancel out destructively, and the correct answer, they are reinforced, right? And constructively, of course, right? So this is what our aim is. This is how we can manipulate these quantum operations. So we are not bothered about alpha modulo square, the probabilities, the probabilistic nature of it, that what will happen in the end. We are manipulating these probability amplitudes, which can interfere with each other, and they can interfere destructively and constructively. Okay, so let's move on. Another important aspect that I talked about was entangled qubits. So the entangled qubits are if you have pairs of qubits, like which are in the above state, or they can be in any combination, but they can also exist in the superposition of those product states, right? And the superposition of those product states are actually entangled states. And of course, there can be maximally entangled states. So the only thing mathematically is that they cannot be written as a product state. So if they are the pure state. So what is important for the entangled qubits is this: that there is an intrinsic randomness in the quantum entanglement. So in the classical correlations, of course there are classical correlations. For example, there are two gloves. One is left and one is right, and one is kept on Earth and the other is kept on Moon. So I don't know what the glove on the Earth is. So if I look at it and I find it to be left, I know what is the state of the glove on the Moon is, right? So they are correlated. But this, and of course the result is random for me, because when I check, I'll see that what is for me, it could have been left or it could have been right. So the result is totally random for me. But this randomness is coming in it because of my ignorance. So it was left all the time on the Earth, right? So I didn't look at it. So I was ignorant about it, but it didn't change its states at that time. But quantum entanglement is very different. the randomness is intrinsic. So it changes its state at the time of measurement. Just like a quantum particle, single quantum qubit changes its state at the time of measurement. An entangled particle decides in which state in which it has to go at the time of measurement. So whenever I measure it, if I find this to be in the up state, the one on the moon, so I have two particles which are entangled the same way as I saw the classical correlation, and I keep one on Earth and one on moon. So when I measure one on the Earth, it randomly goes into the horizontal or the vertical. And then if it is in the vertical, I know the one on the moon is horizontal. And if this is the horizontal, I know the one on the moon is vertical, right? So it is a totally random result. Why totally random? Because at the time of measurement, it collapses into one of the two states. But the one on the moon also collapses into the corresponding state, right? Corresponding state with relevance to this. Okay. So it's very, so wherever we need randomness for our computation, quantum entanglement is very useful. Okay. So let's see. Of course, it has other features as well, but we will not talk about those now. So what is linear optical quantum computing? So we have seen what properties qubits have. We can manipulate their probability amplitudes. We can manipulate we can create entanglement between them, and we can make use of the intrinsic randomness. We can we have a register, and it can one quantum operation is done simultaneously on all the superposition states. So we have to see that whether we can use that for this or not. Okay, so let's move on. So this linear optical quantum computing is a computing setup which is very interesting in the sense that it only consists of beam splitters and phase shifters, right? There are beam splitters and there are phase shifters. And of course, these are just the mirrors. These end ones are just the mirrors to diverter. So there are beam splitters. I'll explain what beam splitters are. So beam splitters and phase shifters, by which you can do computation. And these are the photon sources initially in each. And then these are the photon detectors at the end, which we said was necessary for a quantum computation to measure each qubit, each qubit, to do a measurement qubit by qubit in the end, okay? And to find the state of each qubit. So this is what a linear optical setup is. The interesting thing is that, as I said, that all quantum operations are just unitary operations, right? All quantum gates are just unitary operations. So any unitary operation can be given by a combination of beam splitters and phase shifters, okay? But the problem is that there are some non-linear operations which are difficult to implement. So that is why linear optical quantum computation, although it can simulate anything, but implementation is difficult. So universal quantum computing has not been achieved by it, right? So we can see what we can do with it. So as I said, that any unitary operation can be written by this quantum, by the linear optical setup. So I have these are beam splitters, right? These are just two particle gates, right? 2 qubit gates. So I construct a 3 qubit gate, which is a U3 interferometer, by using these 2 qubit gates and the phase shifters, which are alpha 1, alpha 2, and alpha 3. So and similarly, any UN operation can be written as a combination of these 2 qubit gates and the phase shifters in the linear optical setup. So what is a beam splitting action? So this is a beam splitter. Photon interferometry can be done. This is a photon that is incident on it, and it has 2 paths to go. There's certain transmittivity of it. It will be just as a half silvered mirror, and the photon may go straight or it may be deflected. So the thing is that what are the possibilities for 2 photons when they are incident on the beam splitter? One from here and the one from here. They both can go in this direction. So one transmitted, one reflected. Both transmitted, both reflected, and both transmitted, and one transmitted, one reflected. The interesting thing is that for indistinguishable photons, these middle 2 phenomena, they never happen. right? And this is because of the destructive interference. This is because this photon, which is deflected from the lower portion, it that you can manipulate to not occur, right? So then you can do some quantum operations with them. So, but this is for the indistinguishable photons. Let's see how it is. So it's what is meant by indistinguishability? We can make two photons or any two particles distinguishable by any means, right? We can make their polarization different, we can make their spins different, but there is one way by which you can really distinguish between them, that is you introduce a time delay between them. So if they're exactly on time, their tau is 0, the time delay is 0 between the two photons. Time delay means that both of them are coming at the same time, okay? So then they are totally indistinguishable. So we have kept all the other features same, or we are not looking at those features. We are not worried about polarization. We are not measuring it. We are not measuring about the energy states, but we are only looking at that which photon comes early and which late. So this creates, this is our criteria for distinguishability. So if they both arrive at the same time, they are totally indistinguishable. And if they are in such a way that they do not overlap at all, then they are totally distinguishable. And then there is a partial distinguishability in which there's slight overlap, and there is a delay as well. Okay. So the interesting thing is, we look at that phenomena in which it happens that the coincidence counts never occur. That is, both do not go to the same to different detectors, rather than they go to the same detector. This phenomena. So if so we have used these two photons, and which we have, one is delayed and delayed than the other with some tau, and we calculate the coincidence counts at the end, right? So the probability. So we repeat the experiment many number of times, okay, and then we calculate the probability of the coincidences. We see that the probability of and in fact we have calculated the probability that it comes out to be like this. So we see that this is in fact proportional to, if you can see that if we keep the tau to be equal to 0, this term goes away, right? For the tau to be equal to 0, the term with the determinant of u goes away, and we are only left with the permanent of u. So what is the tau is equal to 0? It is this dip over here in the delay graph. So this dip, this is the tau is equal to 0. So in fact, at tau is equal to 0, the coincidence probability, whatever it is coming out to be, is proportional to the permanent of u modulo square, right? And we said in the beginning that Balian, he proved that computing the permanent of a unitary matrix or any matrix is in fact a Sharp-P-Hard problem. So by using this interferometry, using indistinguishable photons, we can compute permanence with our Sharp-P-Hard. And it was for the 2 cross 2. So permanent, again, as I told before, it is simply u11, u22 plus u12, u21, and determinant is with a minus sign over here. And of course, with a 50-50 beam splitter, the permanent is 0. So this step would be touching this x-axis. So it will be 0. You will be getting a 0 coincidence count. That the thing that we explained earlier. But if it is not a 50-50 beam splitter, then of course you will not get the 0 probability. So this is in fact a quantum computer. It has computed the permanent, of course not to be, but this is a kind of quantum computation. So it has computed the permanent of u by just a photon interferometry experiment. Okay. So this interferometer is a quantum operation which is occurring on it. And in fact, it is not only this, but you can compute the coincidence probabilities, and you can do boson sampling with them. That is the probability that you can get the coincidence counts in the end on some subsets of that. It is in fact proportional to the permanent of the submatrix US, right? And divided by the S1 factorial, Sn factorial, and so on. And when you do this, and it has been done experimentally, in fact, and they have not only done this, but they have proven that even if there are photon losses, it is successful. Okay, in fact, so it is very much experimental thing, the boson sampling, and this is the sampling setup. These are the 7 qubits which have been entered, which are entered into the setup. And in the end, they pass through this grid, and they are distributed at large number of outputs. So the coincidence click at different detectors, of course, there are 7, there will be 7 clicks, but the coincidence clicks at different detectors, different set of detectors will determine different permanence of the matrices. Okay, so this is how you, and of course, it is a sampling problem as well. That is, you are sampling the photo counts from the probability distribution of the photons that are scattered from this linear optical interferometer. Okay, so you have done a sampling problem, solved a sampling problem using the linear optical setup. And this is a classically hard task to implement. So let's see what else you can do with it. So let's look at the 3 photon coincidences. The 3 photon coincidences, as I said, that okay, it's U, and this any unitary can be it can be implemented by these beam splitters and phase shifters. And then if you do it, if you do the coincidence counts in the end with these 3 of them, so you start with 3 single photons, pass them through the interferometer, which is a quantum operation. In fact, it is the QPU, quantum processor. This U is the quantum processor. And then in the end, you detect them, and the coincidence counts that you detect, that you measure, of course, you have to repeat the experiment many, many times, because you want to calculate the probability of coincidences. So you repeat the experiment many, many times, and you see that the probability of coincidence comes out to be something like this. So you see that there is a dip in between. This is when so this is tau 1 and tau 3, the time delay between the photon 1 and the photon 3, and the photon 2 is exactly on time. Tau 2 is 0. So there's a dip in between, and then this dip is in fact the permanent of U, right? So if you have you have done the experiment many, many times, and you have calculated the probability, and you do it with the distinguishable photons, you will get the permanent. But if you do not do it with the distinguishable indistinguishable photons, then there are these regions, right? The outer regions. And these outer regions, they contain, these are the functions of permanent, determinant, and immanent of U. So it is not only the permanent, but the determinant also occurs in that, and there is an immanent in that as well. So we also saw in our expression for 2 photon interferometry that it was a function of both permanent and determinant. And when they were simultaneous, and determinant term went away. Okay, what is this quantity immanent of U? Let's see. So we are now SU3. Okay, SU2 there is no immanent. There is a permanent and there is a determinant. But in fact, there are, if you know some group theory, there are 3 classes of. I won't go much into it, but there are just 3 classes. Of course, these classes depend on the permutation. So if there are 2 permutations, this is one class. If there are 3 permutations, this is one class. No permutation, this is identity class. And for the permanent, the character of the classes, these are 1, 1, 1 all. And for the determinant is 1, -1, 1. Of course, that is how you get alternate negative signs. Okay. And there is a third term, which is an immanent. There is a third class. There is a third irreducible representation, in which there are the characters are 2, 0, and -1. Those are the immanent. So in fact, there is a common name for all of them, which is immanent for all permanent, determinant, and immanent. They are common. They are all in fact immanents. So and those immanents, they depend on this chi lambda sigma, right? On the character of these values, where these are the characters which are given in the table. So and what does it mean? It means that the permanent is simply all of them are 1, as we said, sum of all products of all possible permutations. So these are the permuting operators. These are permuting 2, and these are permuting 3. Then the determinant with the negative sign, and then the immanent. Okay, so there are 3 quantities of them. So there are 4 linearly independent immanents of all possible permutations. Okay, so let's see that what have we done with them. So as I said here, that these are the function of all of them: permanent, determinant, and immanent. In our recent work, this work was 2014. In our recent work, We have been trying to eliminate permanent indeterminate, and in fact, as you go on, this was U3. In U4, there are 5 classes and there are 5 eminents. So we wanted to have the output coincidence probability to be the function of only one eminent. Okay, so we have succeeded in finding the coincidence probability to be the function of uh, one eminent of U and its permutations. Okay, there are still the permutations of U in that, but of course it is only one eminent in that. So for 4 classes, SU4 or U4, there are 5 classes, and we have been able to attain the 5 different eminents and the functions of eminence. Okay, this is what we did. And how we did, we took the input to be the entangled state, right? So this is how where we have used the entanglement, and where there is a randomness in it. So whenever it goes and it is mired, it is correlated with the other particle, and it affects the output state. Okay, so we have used the time bin, and so 2 time bin entangled states can be written as are like this. So one in 0 at time t, then the other will be in the state, one is in 1 and the other will be in state 0 at time t plus tau. So this is the same form of writing it in the form as we saw earlier for the entangled states. Okay, but in our case we have dealt with multimode time bin entangled states. Multimode means that we are not saying that the photons are single frequency. We have taken them a frequency profile pi of omega, and then we have made it interact, and in the end we have calculated the coincidence probability. Okay, so the time delay, it appears as a phase over here in this initial state, right? Okay, so we move on, and what have we done with it? So our computational task was to find, of course, the function of imminence. So how we did it? We had the input. The input was the n number of input photons, and of course you can have an m port interferometer, so you can enter the photons on the subsets of them, and then the time delays between the photons in each input was known. The partition lambda of n was known. Partition lambda, I mean which imminent you want to calculate. So so then the server does what? So we have, so with these input photons, time delays, and the partition, we can create an input entangled state. We have all this information. We create an input entangled state, and the server, he repeatedly injects time bin entangled multiphoton states and records the coincidences for the detectors placed at the end, right? So what he does is that he injects the input states and coincidence count. Coincidence count means that all detectors click at the same time. Of course, there are other events happening as well, but we are ignoring those events. So it's a probabilistic process. Okay. So in the end, the probability that we get, it will be used, the probability of coincidence that we get, it will use to estimate a quadratic function of one immanent of un and its permutations, which is like this. Okay. It contains only one immanent, which is just lambda. So moving on from the problem of just computing the permanence, we can compute, so far we have achieved, it's a function of immanence. Of course, our main aim, we are still looking forward to find the immanent itself, or the modular square of one immanent. So, and of course, this is a sampling problem, right? We have just sampled out those events in which there are coincidence counts. And in this whole experiment, which we have done in this computational task, the quantum advantage is not the complexity of the problem. Okay, it's not that it can be done in the polynomial time. The quantum advantage is that it is difficult to simulate these experiments classically, and it is easier to simulate it quantum mechanically. Okay, it's a very simple setup. And why it's a very simple setup? Because it can be done on a chip. These are chips available. On a single chip, you can put all the photon inputs, and you can have the detectors in the end, and you can have the interferometers, mirrors, phase shifters, everything in between on the single chip, right? And then when you detect it, you would be able to. So what is the advantage of being on a single chip? The advantage is that there are very less photon losses, right? So this is integrated photonic circuits, which can be used to implement these these computational tasks. We have done we have simulated another of this setup as well, which is on an integrated photonic chip, and there is a scenario in it, in which one can in which there are generally the architecture is in such a way that it forces more than one photon into the input, and then we have seen all the possible outputs at the end. And this I've just shown one of the results. In this, we can see that there are the dips, which are the destructive interferences between the input photons, and there are the peaks, which are the constructive interference, and there are these bimodal structures, which are due to the photons coming in the same port at the input. So this is because the interference of the photons in the same input. And of course, there are other results as well, but this is a phenomenon which simulates this sort of a integrated photonic circuit. And then, so we have just this has also been just published. So this you can see that in these processes we have only done, of course, we cannot use them for any computational task. We can just do some problems like boson sampling that I said. The boson sampling is you cannot do all the tasks with boson sampling. It's just a sampling problem. In here also, we have just done the sampling problems. So, and it's of course a non-universal quantum computing. But it is important in the sense that that there are some quantum processes that can do computational tasks with just the linear optical setups, okay, which are of course easier to implement. Okay, so let's move on to just this quantum annealing stuff, which we also did, and it's very different from what I told before, linear optical setup. It's just a quantum annealer in which it's a D-wave annealer which we use to solve some problem, and it's a quantum annealer. A D-wave quantum annealer solves the adiabatic problems. The adiabatic problems are such that the process is done so slowly that the qubit remains in the initial state only, right? So it does not, it ends up in the same state. So so a group of students, the bachelor students, that did this problem, and of course in the annealer there are actual qubits, and the process starts with the qubits in the superposition state. So each qubit is a superconducting flux qubit, and it's a two-level quantum system. But the thing is that this D-wave annealer can solve only optimization problems, right? So we solve them with them where we have to minimize or maximize a function. So we use we solved some problem with that. So I'll not go into the detail of what quantum annealer is, just to tell you that what we did with it. So it's a traffic optimization problem. So we have like how would we? So our aim was to find that there are these junctions, and we have to control the traffic signals in such a way that the maximum traffic flow is achieved in minimum time. Okay, this was the problem, and of course it's an optimization problem. So we have to maximize our traffic flow, right, or minimize the congestion. So there are all these different modes which we have to take into consideration, and then for the optimization problems, we have to have an objective function in which these are our variables, and this q is the objective cost function, which we have to see what it is. And then these are there are various constraints that we have taken into account. So the first thing was the cost term to activate the mode at an intersection that we clear all out of the most traffic. And then Q2 was the coordination term. Of course, there were many factors in it. And then we had a constraint term that ensured that the Q3 was a constraint term that ensured that only one path is selected at a time. So using this, we found some results, and we had like if you include all of them. And of course, in this, we have to calculate, we have to compute, we have to make a Q function, and then we objective function, and then we input into the computer, into the QBSolve, which is the quantum computer. And we also do some classical part on it. So initially the classical part, the post-processing is the classical part, and then we can solve it with including all these factors, Q1, Q2, and Q3 on the hybrid, classical and QBSolve hybrid, which is this. And this is the time wasted, which is slightly less than this. And of course, and then we do not include, no syncing was done. That is so in our problem, every 5 seconds the new data, the real time data is taken, and then it is optimization is done according to that. So if you do no syncing, then of course there was this Q1 plus Q3 only, the slight increase in that. Of course, it is not a very promising result. And then there is a fixed cycle in which there is no the signal change as it does routinely. So of course, there's not an advantage can be seen, but in fact, it leads to there are faulty qubits, there are losses, but there is if the size of the processor increases, the number of qubits increases, then it will be giving a better results. That it can outperform the classical. So I think I thought that I'll not reach this point, so that's it. So thank you very much.
That was very interesting and very fulfilling amount of information. And I would like to thank you, Ms. Harsha, for managing time for us from your busy schedule and managing your precious time and bringing such beneficial and useful information for us. And I would also like to thank all the participants for attending this webinar, and hope you all learned and enjoyed, and that this session had remained interesting for you all. Okay, so I would again request you to please, if you haven't mentioned your names and your email addresses in the chat box, so please mention them. And if you have, then it's well and good. But if you haven't, please mention them, so that based on your presence, we may provide you with certificates. So in the end, I would like to ask you all to please provide us with your feedback on the event through email, and let us know if we can do anything to make it better in the future. So that's all. See you soon. Thank you and farewell.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.